Welcome to the Numisphere, a podcast diving into all things in the sphere of numismatics, talking the latest news and trends of precious metals, coins, currency, and more. Let's start the show.
Today we're diving into the fascinating parallels between the Roman Empire's economic struggles and today's monetary policies in the U.S. We explore what happens when empires can no longer fuel their economies by printing money, from the decline of Rome due to precious metal shortages and hyperinflation to the modern challenges of fiat currency and global trade. We'll discuss how history might not repeat, but it certainly rhymes. Stay tuned as we draw vital lessons from the past to understand our economic future. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoy watching the Numisphere podcast, and you can always find us on Instagram or Facebook at AHCoinCo, or visit us at ahcoinco.com.
Welcome to the Numisphere, a podcast diving into all things in the sphere of numismatics, talking the latest news and trends of precious metals, coins, currency, and more. Let's start the show.
Today on Numisphere, we're going to be asking the question, what happens when a country debases its currency over and over again until it's almost completely depleted? We're going to be drawing on examples of the Roman Empire and what happened to the currency that they used, and furthermore, drawing on if this could potentially happen to some place like, let's say, the United States. And today, I want to introduce to you Colin Horan, welcoming him back on the Numisphere podcast. He's going to be talking to us about the Roman Empire and about the currency debasement that happened therefore. And there's a lot of history here. And I just want to welcome you in, Colin. Thank you for bringing your input today. And please take it away.
Well, first, thank you for having me on the show.
Absolutely.
And I think I'd like to start the baseline of the Roman monetary system. So starting back during the time of Augustus in the first century, the Roman coins really followed bronze denominations, silver denominations, and gold denominations. The bronze denominations were the quadrans, semis, S, and pondus, and sestertius. And those were really used for local trade within the empire. You know, buy a loaf of bread and buy a night at a hotel or something.
Common like our dollars and coins.
Basically, a small change. It was small change. Like in Pompeii, they find lots of small change from all the businesses around.
Okay.
And the silver denominations at the time were denarii.
Okay.
And these coins are the staple coins within the empire itself. This is what mainly larger transactions would have been done in, on a larger scale. And then you have a gold coin called the aureus. And the aureus was used more for international trade or for extremely large purchases because it took 25 denarii to equal 1 auri.
Gotcha.
So in the time of Augustus, these coins were actually relatively pure. The denarius was in the high 90% for silver content percentages. And as the empire moved into the second century, it was embroiled in expansion and more war. And some of these emperors started to slowly, over time, decrease the amount of silver in the denarii in order to strike more coins. They would replace the percentage by something like a little bit more copper each time.
But how much percentage were they reducing it each time, or did it change?
It changed based on the emperor's needs. Usually it fluctuated between, 1% or 2%, maybe 3%. The Emperor Domitian actually temporarily raised the silver content in the denarii, but he's only one of the few to ever do that. But by the time you're getting to the mid-second century, you're already down to 80%, 70% from that original 90%. And people start to take notice. But it's a very slow change. So not everyone has a quick notice to it because the coins look exactly the same.
It's funny how you say that it was basically at the whim of the emperor and according to the emperor's needs.
Yes.
Right. We could almost replace that with it's whatever the government needs is what they can help value the dollar. I'm just trying to find those correlations, right?
Yeah, and something with the government's needs actually comes in the early 3rd century, where there's a new denomination that was introduced called the Antoninianus.
Okay.
It was introduced by the Emperor Caracalla. It's actually valued at 2 denarii. It's double worth of the denarii, but it actually only contained initially 1.5 denarii worth of silver.
Oh, wow.
The other half a denarii got pocketed by the government.
So that's almost like a 2.5 time debasement in one flow.
Yeah, and at that
One
point,
strike from him.
you're already down to 65% silver content, but they're already pocketing that half a denari's worth of silver back into the government and basically releasing this coin saying, yeah, it's worth 2 denarii.
Sure.
But in reality, its actual value is only 1.5.
After they get their 25%
Yeah.
silver out of the coin.
Yeah.
But that's just insane. I can't believe that. So tell me a little bit more. How did the empire respond to this debasement? Like you were talking about how there were so few emperors that helped bring that debasement back up. Tell me about the next steps. What happens with all of these different emperors leading the way to that continued debasement?
Well, a lot of the time, people didn't notice too much until it was very too late because, they use these copper denominations for local trade. Yep. So the copper denominations, they steadily decreased in weight as well, and eventually they all got phased out.
Okay.
The quadrans and the semis was gone by the 2nd century, the mid-2nd century, and really only the sestertius will survive for any long amount of time, but eventually that does disappear too.
What?
And the denarii will slowly, obviously gets debased more and more over time. Mm-hmm. And these people start to lose trust in the actual currency.
And we're talking about the citizens of the empire.
The citizens of the empire, yes. Okay. And over about a course of 50 years after the introduction of the Antoninianus, mm-hmm. the denarii is ceremonial at this point, and it contains almost no silver in it. It has a silver wash layer on top.
So we went from being up in the upper 90s, right, in its purity, dwindling down to that 75, 80%. Then we hacked it in half, and then we went even further to the point where we were just coating copper coins.
Yes, precisely. At the beginning of the 3rd century, you're at 60, 70%. Mm-hmm. But by the end of it, the denarii gets phased out. It was only ceremonial, and it only had a silver wash. And even in the 260s, they had the silver wash on the denarii.
Now, what kind of impact did this have on the Roman Empire's ability to commence trade throughout?
Well, a lot of people, while resorting to their provincial town coinage of copper or the Roman imperial mint of copper, they eventually started wanting to barter rather than trade with the currency because so much of the good currency was actually being taken out of circulation and hoarded away, while the bad money continued to circulate. And many vendors knew as the emperors, changed. So many emperors changed during the 3rd century. It was like one every 5 years. Mm-hmm. They would just hoard away the good stuff and the vendors wouldn't take the bad coins.
Now, I imagine that they must have experienced some type of hyperinflationary event.
Oh, yeah.
Now, tell me, was there a period during which they experienced the hyperinflationary event?
All of this
what occurred?
Yeah, all of this is hyperinflation with the currency being devalued. And that means it takes more denarii, more Antoniniani to purchase your everyday items. Mm-hmm. As something like the soldier's pay. Right. Soldier's pay would also exponentially increase because with the emperors constantly rotating out, mm-hmm. like there's one year where you have 6 different emperors in just one single year. But with each emperor, they need to gain the loyalty of the army because they're usually the ones that usurped the throne.
Okay.
They need to promise the army that will up your pay.
So they're buying them off by upping their pay, and the only way they can afford to do it is by debasing the currency.
Exactly, because you only have the same amount of silver.
Oh my goodness. That sounds like a bad ending.
Yeah.
Regardless, right? But now I do have a question more related to the hyperinflation. I read somewhere that they experienced price increases over 1,000%, and they experienced it pretty quickly.
Yes.
Now, there was some type of emperor rule that was put into play to cap prices.
Yeah, so Diocletian's Edict on Maximum Prices, which was issued, if I can recall correctly, around 301 at the beginning of the 4th century.
Yep.
It was meant as a cap to merchant prices after Diocletian did a monetary reform. It completely changed the monetary system. Mm-hmm. And he tried to cap the prices of a whole range of items, like thousands of items, anything ranging from bread, to clothing, all the way up to something called Tyrian purple, which is the purple dye which is used, which is
that royal color purple that
they used to
togas and robes.
You could only get it from killing snails. Back in Mediterranean snails, so it was really expensive. It costed I think 100,000 denarii at that time.
Wow!
But obviously, denarii is being used as a figure of measurement for a coin that doesn't actually exist anymore at that point.
So they were measuring their prices in denarii, but at that time, the denarii was already phased out. And
It was phased out 5 years prior as a commemorative, but it had already been commemorative for another 20 or so years before then.
So it's almost as if they had to abandon it.
Yeah, and the new currency was based off the denarii, but in like 8 times bigger, 4 times bigger than your denarii and Antoninianus.
So do you think that this cycle that was happening, wasn't there a period of time in like only 49 years that 50 plus emperors reigned? It's because of that exact thing that you were talking about, where they would have to promise the soldiers more money, but they weren't able to follow through. So these guys were getting taken out left and right.
And a new emperor would usurp and then come in, and then they have to promise them more.
And it's corrupt to me, doesn't it?
Very, and sometimes they're put in even more unfortunate circumstances. The Emperor Gallienus, in the middle period of all this, around the year 260, he actually loses half the empire to a usurper named Postumus.
Okay.
And Postumus takes over France and Spain and Britain, like that whole area there.
The Gauls.
Yeah, the Gallic area of the Roman Empire. But more importantly, he takes over the silver mines in Hispania. So Gallienus loses a huge amount of silver during his reign.
Right.
His goes from like 30% all the way down to 5 to 2%.
So they couldn't even source the silver to
They couldn't source
coinage they need.
Even the Gallic Empire, they actually produced for a little while better quality silver coins than the actual Roman Empire, because they had access to those mines.
Now, that's interesting. For me, I'm just thinking about the correlations that could possibly exist with our current economy. And imagine almost if the Federal Reserve didn't have the ability to print more. That sounds like kind of what the empire was being choked up in, because they lost their source of that precious metal. It could no longer flood the economy with cash. So cash became constrained, right?
Yeah.
And the economy was slowing down for them.
And adding to that hyperinflation, it says that they have to decrease at a faster rate with the limited resources that they have.
It almost sounds if I were looking to be a raider, let's say I'm Attila the Hun, right? Or I'm one of these Vals or Vandals, right? Or the Gauls, and I'm looking to get into the Roman Empire. They're looking pretty weak, right? And at the same time, too, nobody wants to deal in their currency outside of the direct citizenship, right? Because they're forced to. So trade is, I imagine, slowing down incredibly.
Trade slows down. International trade is on a separate note, because they don't like to touch the gold.
Okay.
They do on occasion, but they don't like to change the purity of it, because that's their like lifeline with international trade.
Okay.
But the Ori value will rise and fall, and eventually that does get replaced too.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, people they don't like those copper coins.
Right. So it's almost as if that debasement basically discouraged the entire population away from utilizing it as a way to transact.
Exactly. They lose trust in their government because they don't trust their government to actually provide the money that they need. And that is sound money.
And where did the people turn to? They turned to that barter system, right, which further broke down trade routes and localized trade, right, which really hurt the empire in its ability to move goods throughout the entire region. And now you have people looking to get other gold or other silver, right? Like the silver from Spain that was just acquired from the
Gallic Empire, yeah. And then when Rome takes it back, it didn't change a thing. It was already too late.
It's too late, and the world had moved on.
Yeah, and that's why Diocletian's edict on maximum prices failed. People didn't follow it because they knew the currency was going to get devalued again.
Right.
And about 10 years from then, Constantine will reign. His coins are only a fraction, a half, a fourth the size of what Diocletian originally started with in around 296. The currency is devalued that quickly.
Wow. So for me now the light bulbs are popping, right? And I'm saying to myself, if we think about, the Coinage Act back in the late 1800s, it was 1873, I believe, when we started to move from silver being able to be minted into coinage for U.S. citizens, right? Now we've started to move away from the silver. And ever since we basically brought on the fiat dollar, right? And from that time to now, we've lost it's estimated more than 97% of that purchase power has been taken out of that dollar. And this is done in many forms, right? But basically, it's been currency debasement as we continue to print and create derivatives of the dollar. The whole system is building up this debt without much collateral behind it. And it almost feels to me like there's a huge parallel here of those last blips or days in the Roman Empire when they were just trying to shuffle around this completely debased currency, and the people reject it.
And I can give you another parallel too. Sure. A lot of the stuff that was happening in the Roman Empire was war. They were constantly funding wars. Right. And each of these wars with the soldiers, you need to print more and more money and basically shovel all that money into usually fruitless wars. They don't give you really anything back other than trying to maintain the status quo. Right. So the more and more amount of money being struck and sent out and also devalued at the same time.
Flooding the system with currency for these wars.
And you just have way too much worthless money. That's basically
interesting you bring that up. I don't know how many dollars exist in the world, but I hear there's trillions. I wonder how many of those ones are worthless.
I would think quite a few.
Well, yeah, I have to say, I really do appreciate you bringing in this tie to history. I think that with all things, if we can look back on history and pull these really important examples from the books, from the best books that we know to be true, and put that to today's situations, there's a lot of things that are on the wall for us. And I'm really curious, obviously there's some huge changes here, right? We can print money, digital facet, right? We don't need silver mines in order to make the money now that we're on this fiat currency system. But I do wonder, can you get the dollar debased enough where the people have had enough and they turn away and they look for something else? And truthfully, that's the thing that I think everybody is wondering. Could it be that people turn away from the use of the dollar? And where would that leave us in the economy here in the United States compared to the rest of the world? And also, what happens to global trade? I mean, all of these things could be jeopardized.
Like the Roman ori, the U.S. dollar is so important with the Bretton Woods conference to international trade. It's the staple of many international trade agreements and like the petrodollar and all that. The U.S. is backing a lot of important ideas in trade.
And bringing up some more relevant current events, obviously with everything that's been happening in Ukraine region, in the Middle Eastern region, and the BRICS nations coming together, having to find ways to adapt to the sanctions that the United States put on them. It's almost as if they have to find an alternative to using the dollar in order to get these things done. And I wonder if that same example that we're talking about, where people turn away from that denarius or they turn away from potentially that dollar, is that already happening? Is the world already making that momentum? And where could the United States, if the United States were parallel to the Roman Empire, where could it be in that journey? And then if you take a look at what happened back then and how long it took to play out each of these moves, we live in an accelerated world. Right? Transactions are being settled lickety-split.
Laws are instant. Everyone finds out about it.
News travels fast. I imagine that if we get pushed to that brink, the ending will be of an acceleration unlike which has been written in the history books. So definitely a lot more questions. You brought a little bit of anxiety to me with the history lesson, but I have to say, if history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. So there's definitely something to this. Really appreciate your input on this today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Numisphere podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on the next episode. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Numisphere. Until next time. Thank you for listening to the Numisphere podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on the next episode. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Numisphere. Until next time.